The morning sun glinted off the towering windows of the Skylight Plaza, casting sharp rays across the 50th floor. Ethan Cole stood by his expansive office window, the city of Avalon sprawling beneath him. A smirk curled his lips, a smile that was more about power than joy. The gleaming skyscrapers were a testament to his relentless ambition and meteoric rise. "Mr. Grant, your next meeting starts in 5 minutes," came the voice of his assistant, Ella, over the intercom. "Thank you, Ella. I'll be there shortly," Ethan replied, straightening his bespoke tie and heading toward the conference room. As he walked, fragments of memory tugged at his thoughts. He saw himself, younger and eager, arriving in Avalon with nothing but determination. "You'll never last a week in this business, kid," an older colleague had once scoffed. Ethan had clenched his fists, vowing to prove them wrong. Now he whispered to himself, "Look at me now," his eyes glinting with cold satisfaction. Miles away, in a luxury apartment overlooking Rosetta Park, Clara Morgan adjusted her lipstick, her hands trembling slightly. "You can do this, Clara," she said to her reflection in the mirror. But it wasn't just lunch with her husband. It was far more than that. She lightly touched her abdomen, where a delicate secret was growing, a secret that could change their lives forever. "How am I going to tell him?" she whispered, anxiety tightening her chest. Back at Skylight Plaza, Ethan wrapped up another multi-million-dollar deal. "Congratulations, Mr. Grant," one of the executives said, shaking his hand firmly. "Another jewel in your empire's crown." Ethan nodded, his polished smile practiced but hollow. "That's the goal, isn't it? Building empires." Meanwhile, Clara walked through the bustling Avalon Mall, her heart pounding with unease. Bright displays of designer goods surrounded her, but her mind was elsewhere. She glanced at a shimmering storefront, remembering how Ethan used to surprise her with extravagant gifts in the early days of their marriage. "Mrs. Grant," a saleswoman greeted her warmly. "We have some new pieces that would be perfect for you." Clara forced a polite smile. "Not today, thank you. I'm just waiting for my husband." The saleswoman nodded in understanding. "Of course, enjoy your lunch." Clara walked toward the restaurant, her hand instinctively resting on her abdomen. As she stepped through the elegant glass doors, the maitre d' greeted her. "Mrs. Cole, welcome. Your husband hasn't arrived yet, but your table is ready." She nodded and followed him to her seat. As she settled in, her thoughts wandered to the future. She pictured holding a baby in her arms, Ethan smiling proudly by her side, a happy, complete family. But a voice in the back of her mind sowed doubt. Ethan was always so focused on his empire. Would he have room in his life for a child? Glancing at her watch, she noticed he was late. It wasn't unusual. She picked up the menu, pretending to study it, but her hands trembled. "You can do this," she murmured. "We'll be a family. Everything will work out." She couldn't have known that within minutes, her world would be shattered, and Ethan's meticulously built empire would begin to crack. Clara's fingers tapped nervously on the table, as her eyes darted between the restaurant entrance and her watch. When Ethan finally appeared, her breath caught, but not for the reason she hoped. Ethan entered the mall, his commanding presence drawing attention. But it wasn't just him. Beside him walked a striking woman, laughing at something he'd said, her hand resting casually on his arm. Clara's blood ran cold. She recognized the woman immediately, Isabel, the new executive at Ethan's company. "It can't be," she whispered, her voice shaky. Unable to contain herself, Clara stood, her heart pounding as she approached the couple. Her eyes were fixed on Ethan, disbelief and pain etched into her features. "Ethan," she called, her voice trembling. He turned, and for a fleeting moment, surprise and guilt flashed across his face. Then his expression hardened, a mask of indifference falling into place. "Clara," he said flatly. "What are you doing here?" Isabel glanced between Ethan and Clara, a smirk curling on her lips, her amusement unmistakable. "We had lunch planned," Clara said, her voice quivering as she fought to steady herself. Ethan shrugged nonchalantly. "Must have slipped my mind," he said. "I'm busy, as you can see." Clara felt her heart sink, the sharp edges of his indifference cutting deep. "Ethan, I need to talk to you. It's important." "Now's not the time," Ethan interrupted, his tone cold and dismissive. Isabel laughed, a piercing sound that echoed in the space around them. "Oh, sweetheart, don't you get it? Ethan has more pressing things to do than indulge a trophy wife." Clara's breath caught as tears welled in her eyes. She barely managed to whisper, "Ethan, please." "Enough, Clara," Ethan barked, his voice reverberating through the mall. "You're embarrassing us. Go home. I don't have time for your dramas." The air seemed to freeze as people around them stopped, their gazes fixed on the unfolding scene. Clara stood there, her world crashing down as Ethan's words hit her like a physical blow. "How could you?" she whispered, her voice cracking as tears streamed down her face. Ethan rolled his eyes impatiently. "Grow up, Clara. This is how the real world works. Now if you'll excuse us." He moved past her, Isabel still clinging to his arm, her smile triumphant. The sight was unbearable. Clara felt a strangled sob rise in her throat, and she turned and ran, her vision blurred by tears. She shoved through the crowd, desperate to escape the nightmare. "My God, did you see that?" a woman whispered to her friend, shaking her head in disbelief. "Poor thing," her companion replied, glaring disdainfully at Ethan's retreating figure. A middle-aged man nearby stepped forward, his face etched with indignation. "Hey man, you don't treat your wife like that. Show some respect." Ethan ignored him, his icy gaze briefly following Clara's fleeing figure before turning back to Isabel. "Let's go," he said, guiding her out of the mall as murmurs of disapproval rose around them. Clara ran without direction, the weight of humiliation and despair pressing down on her. Her tears blurred the city around her. She stumbled, bumping into strangers and tripping over her own feet, but she didn't stop. "Ma'am, are you okay?" a security guard asked, his voice filled with concern as she brushed past him. Clara couldn't find the words to respond. She only shook her head and kept going until she finally reached the chilly streets of Avalon. The cold air hit her tear-streaked face, shocking her back to reality. She stopped, panting, one hand instinctively resting on her abdomen. "Oh God," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "What am I gonna do now?" Inside the mall, the incident was still the talk of onlookers. "Did you see his face? Not even a flicker of regret," a teenager said to her group of friends. "Men like him never change," an older woman said, shaking her head sadly. Meanwhile, Ethan and Isabel strolled to his car, seemingly unaffected by the scene they had caused. "Well, that was entertaining," Isabel remarked, her malicious smile returning. Ethan shrugged, his face blank and emotionless. "She'll get over it," he said. "She always does." But as he slid into the plush leather seat of his car, a quiet voice in the back of his mind whispered, "This time, you've gone too far." Clara stood alone on the crowded streets of Avalon, her arms wrapped around herself as if to keep her crumbling world from falling apart completely. Just hours earlier, she had dreamed of sharing a happy family life with Ethan. But now those dreams lay shattered. She cast one last glance at the mall behind her before turning away, her feet carrying her forward with no clear destination. All she knew was that she couldn't go back. Not now, not like this. When Clara finally reached the quiet solace of their apartment, she closed the door softly behind her. The silence was deafening, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. Sliding to the floor, her back against the door, she buried her face in her hands and let the sobs consume her. Memories, unrelenting and vivid, rushed in. "Where are we going?" Clara had laughed 5 years earlier, a blindfold covering her eyes. "Patience, love," Ethan had replied, his voice warm and teasing. "We're almost there." When he removed the blindfold, Clara gasped. They stood atop Avalon Tower, the city sparkling below them like a sea of stars. "Clara," Ethan said, dropping to one knee, "will you make me the happiest man in the world and marry me?" Her laughter, her tears, her joy had all been genuine that night. Now, sitting on the cold floor of their apartment, that memory felt like a cruel taunt. How had they fallen so far? The man who had once cherished her was now a stranger. Her gaze landed on their wedding photo on the shelf. In it, Ethan looked at her with so much love, but that man was gone, replaced by someone cold and unrecognizable. Tears streaming, Clara whispered to herself. How did it come to this? Clara slowly rose from the floor, her legs unsteady as she moved toward the bedroom. Her eyes landed on the wedding photo resting on the nightstand. In the image, Ethan looked at her with such tenderness, it seemed almost like a dream. Where had that man gone? With trembling hands, Clara opened the closet and pulled out a suitcase. Each item of clothing she placed inside felt like another piece of her heart breaking. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered. her voice barely audible as silent tears streamed down her cheeks. She paused by the desk, reaching for a pen and paper. Words began to pour out, a mixture of pain, disillusionment, and a faint glimmer of hope for what lay ahead. Ethan, when we got married, I promised to stand by you in joy and sorrow, but I never imagined that the sorrow would come from you. Today I saw it clearly. The man I once loved no longer exists. Maybe he never did. I can't live a lie anymore. I'm leaving, taking with me not just my shattered hopes but also a new life. Yes, Ethan, I'm pregnant. Maybe one day you'll understand what you've truly lost. Until then, goodbye. She folded the letter carefully, placing it on the neatly made bed. With one last glance around the apartment that had once felt like home, Clara picked up her suitcase and walked out, closing the door softly behind her. Hours later, Ethan returned to the apartment, loosening his tie as he entered. "Clara?" he called, his voice echoing through the eerily silent space. Frowning, he walked through the rooms until he reached the bedroom. His eyes immediately fell on the letter resting on the bed. He picked it up, and as he read, his expression shifted from confusion to shock, and finally to anger. He crumpled the paper in his hand and hurled it against the wall. "Damn it, Clara!" he shouted, his voice reverberating in the empty room. "You can't just walk away like this." But she could. And she had. Later that evening, Ethan stood in a grand banquet hall, surrounded by executives and socialites. The room buzzed with applause as he raised a glass to celebrate his latest victory, the biggest merger of his career. To Ethan Cole, the CEO of a competing firm declared, grinning as he lifted his champagne, "The man who's revolutionized our industry." The crowd cheered, glasses clinking as Ethan took a sip of the champagne. It was crisp, luxurious, but the taste felt bitter on his tongue. The smile on his face was practiced, yet it never reached his eyes. When Ethan finally returned to his penthouse, he loosened his tie and walked in with Isabel trailing behind him, her heels clicking against the marble floors. "What a night, Ethan," Isabel said, laughing as she collapsed onto the leather couch. "Did you see their faces when you announced the merger?" "Absolutely priceless," Ethan grunted in response, heading to the bar to pour himself a whiskey. "What's wrong?" Isabel asked, her playful demeanor turning sour. "You just made history. You should be thrilled." "I'm just tired," Ethan replied flatly, taking a long sip. "Maybe you should head home." Isabel shot up from the couch, her expression incredulous. "Excuse me, I thought I was staying tonight. After everything we've done, we're supposed to be celebrating." Ethan turned to face her, his irritation suddenly flaring. "Look, Isabel, I just need to be alone right now. We'll talk tomorrow." Her eyes narrowed, a mixture of disbelief and anger crossing her face. "I see how it is," she said, grabbing her purse. "You got what you wanted, and now you don't need me anymore." Typical. Before he could respond, she stormed out, slamming the door behind her. Silence enveloped the penthouse. Ethan walked to the window, staring out at the bustling city below. Avalon's skyline glittered, indifferent to the turmoil unraveling at its pinnacle. His gaze wandered to a photo sitting on the nearby shelf, a picture of him and Clara on their wedding day. She looked radiant, her joy unmistakable. Even in the photograph, the love in her eyes was palpable. Ethan picked up the frame, his thumb brushing over Clara's smiling face. "What have I done?" he murmured, his voice heavy with regret. The following days saw Ethan bury himself in work with a new level of ferocity. He threw himself into endless meetings, fierce negotiations, and late nights in his office. His actions screamed of a man determined to silence the hollow ache inside him. But no matter how many deals he closed or accolades he earned, the empty void remained, a constant reminder of what he had lost. And deep down, Ethan knew that his glass empire, so meticulously built, was beginning to crack. One particularly grueling afternoon, his assistant, Claire, knocked timidly on the door. "Mr. Cole, there's someone here to see you. He says he's an old friend." Ethan frowned. "I don't have old friends. Send him away." Before Claire could respond, the door opened, and a middle-aged man stepped inside, grinning warmly. "Ethan, long time no see," the man exclaimed. Ethan stared at him, puzzled. "Sorry, but who are you?" The man's smile faltered. "Ethan, it's me, David. We were roommates in college. Remember?" Recognition dawned in Ethan's eyes. "David? That's right. I'm in town on business and thought I'd stop by to see how you were doing," David said, settling into a chair. "I heard about your success. Congratulations, Ethan replied, shifting uncomfortably. How have you been? I can't complain, David said with a smile. Work's good, the kids are growing up, and Sarah sends her regards. By the way, how's Clara? The mention of her name hit Ethan like a blow. His stomach tightened as he tried to compose himself. Clara and we separated, he said flatly. David's expression softened with genuine regret. Oh, Ethan, I'm sorry. You two seemed so happy together. Ethan looked away, unable to meet his friend's compassionate gaze. Things change, he said dryly. Sensing the discomfort, David rose from his seat. Well, it was good seeing you. If you ever need to talk, you know where to find me. Thanks for stopping by, Ethan said, standing to escort him out for him. Once David was gone, Ethan sat alone in his sprawling office. The awards and plaques on the walls seemed to mock him, their shine hollow and meaningless. That night, back in his penthouse, Ethan uncorked an expensive bottle of whiskey, pouring himself a generous glass. He sank onto the plush leather sofa, the remote in his other hand. The television flickered on, showing a montage of his business triumphs. Ethan Cole, the visionary tycoon, a presenter proclaimed. The man who has everything. Ethan laughed bitterly, draining his glass. The liquid burned on its way down, but it did nothing to soothe the ache inside him. He stumbled to the balcony, the cold night air biting against his skin. Below, the city of Orion shimmered, its countless lights twinkling like stars. Each window represented a life, a story, a purpose. Yet here he was, at the pinnacle of success, feeling emptier than ever. For the first time in years, Ethan allowed himself to cry. Meanwhile, across town at Riverview Hospital, Clara's scream echoed through the sterile corridors. She gripped the nurse's hand, sweat streaming down her face as she pushed through the excruciating pain. You're doing great, Clara, Dr. Reyes encouraged. Just one more push. Summoning every ounce of strength she had left, Clara gave one final push. Moments later, the room was filled with the sharp, piercing cry of a newborn. It's a girl, Dr. Reyes announced, lifting the baby so Clara could see. Tears streamed down Clara's face as she reached out for her daughter. My baby, she whispered, her exhaustion mingling with pure joy. My Sophia. As the nurses cleaned and weighed Sophia, Clara couldn't take her eyes off her. The baby was perfect, with a tuft of dark hair and striking blue eyes that reminded Clara of Ethan. The thought of him sent a pang through her chest. He should have been there, sharing this moment, but she pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the tiny miracle in her arms. The days that followed were a whirlwind of joy, exhaustion, and uncertainty. Back home, Clara faced the challenges of single motherhood head-on. It's okay, my love, she murmured in the middle of the night, rocking Sophia in her arms. The baby's cries echoed through the apartment, and Clara felt utterly lost. Just as she thought she couldn't take it anymore, the doorbell rang. Confused, Clara carried Sophia to the door and opened it to reveal an elderly woman standing there, a kind smile on her face. I'm Evelyn, your neighbor from 3C, the woman said gently. I heard the baby crying and thought you might need a hand. Clara hesitated for a moment, her pride warring with her exhaustion, but fatigue won out. Please come in, she said, her voice trembling with relief. Evelyn stepped inside, taking Sophia in her experienced arms. In mere minutes, the baby's cries quieted, her tiny eyes fluttering shut. How did you do that? Clara asked, amazed. Evelyn chuckled. Years of practice, dear. I raised 4 children and helped with 10 grandchildren. If you ever need help, don't hesitate to call on me. Tears welled in Clara's eyes. Thank you, she whispered, feeling a flicker of hope for the first time in weeks. For now, she wasn't alone. And for Sophia's sake, Clara knew she would find the strength to keep going. Thank you, Clara whispered, tears welling in her eyes as Evelyn gently cradled Sophia in her arms. With the ease of someone who had soothed countless infants, Evelyn rocked the baby, humming softly, until Sophia's cries quieted and her little eyes fluttered closed. How did you do that? Claire asked, her voice filled with awe. Evelyn chuckled warmly. Years of practice, dear. I raised 4 children and helped care for 8 grandchildren. If you ever need a hand, just call me. Clara felt a surge of gratitude. I will, she murmured, feeling a flicker of solace for the first time in months. As the weeks passed, Clara gradually adjusted to life as a single mother. She found her rhythm, but an unsettling worry lingered in the back of her mind. Sophia was different. She was quieter than other babies, and often seemed to tire easily. Clara had also noticed a faint, bluish tint to her daughter's lips. Her concerns grew too strong to ignore, so Clara scheduled an appointment with Dr. Lane, a trusted pediatrician. Dr. Lane examined Sophia thoroughly, her expression growing serious. After a long pause, she turned to Clara. "Miss Morgan," I detected a murmur in Sophia's heart. "I'd like to run some additional tests." Clara's world tilted. Is it serious?" she stammered, her voice shaking. "We can't be certain yet," Dr. Lane said gently, "but the sooner we diagnose it, the better her chances will be." The following days blurred together in a whirlwind of tests, consultations, and sleepless nights. Finally, the diagnosis came. Sophia had a congenital heart condition. "She'll need surgery," explained Dr. Patel, a cardiologist, "and she'll require ongoing monitoring." Clara nodded, her resolve hardening. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said, gazing at her daughter, who slept peacefully in her arms. Between the endless medical appointments and the challenges of caring for Sophia, Clara was stretched thin. But one night, sitting at her modest kitchen table with Sophia sleeping nearby, an idea began to take shape in her mind. She thought back to her years as a teacher, to the countless children she had met who lacked access to quality education. What if? Clara murmured to herself, furiously scribbling notes in her notebook. The idea grew into a plan, and the next morning, she reached out to Evelyn. "Evelyn, could you watch Sophia for a few hours?" Clara asked. "There's something important I need to do." "Of course, dear," Evelyn replied, her kind smile reassuring. With Sophia in Evelyn's capable hands, Clara headed to the Riverton Town Hall. She returned hours later, exhausted but optimistic. "How did it go?" Evelyn asked, handing Sophia back to Clara. Clara smiled, kissing her daughter's forehead. "I took the first step toward making my dream a reality. I'm opening a school for underprivileged children." Evelyn's eyes widened with admiration. "That's incredible, Clara. But are you sure you can handle this and care for Sophia?" Clara looked down at her daughter, her heart swelling with determination. "I have to try," she said, "for Sophia and for every child who needs a chance." In the weeks that followed, Clara juggled the demands of motherhood with the daunting task of building her school. There were countless late nights, meetings, and moments of doubt. But each time she felt overwhelmed, a smile from Sophia or a small victory in her efforts renewed her strength. One day, Clara stood outside the modest building that would soon become her school. Sophia nestled in her arms. She felt a wave of emotion wash over her as she looked up at the structure. "Look, Sophia," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "This is our new beginning, a chance to make a difference." Sophia gurgled happily as if she understood. Clara hugged her tightly, her heart brimming with love and hope for the future. In that moment, Clara realized she had found her purpose. The pain of her separation from Ethan, the challenges of single motherhood, and the worries about Sophia's health had all led her here. She was ready to face whatever came next. "We made it, my little one," Clara murmured, kissing Sophia's forehead. "Together, we can do anything." Elsewhere, in the sleek and sterile office of Ethan Cole, silence reigned. 3 years had passed since Clara had left, taking with her their shared dreams and a secret Ethan had yet to discover. The soft hum of the air conditioner was broken by the sudden ring of the phone. Ethan frowned, irritated by the interruption. Picking up the receiver, he barked, "Cole!" "Mr. Cole!" His assistant began hesitantly. "There's a call on line 2. It's about Clara Morgan." Ethan's brow furrowed, a flicker of unease crossing his face. "Clara?" he repeated, his voice low. "Yes, sir," the assistant confirmed. "They said it's urgent." For the first time in years, Ethan felt a pang of uncertainty as he reached for the phone, bracing himself for what was to come. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Clara. He hadn't heard her name in years. His fingers trembled slightly as he picked up the receiver. "Hello?" His voice was steady but guarded. "Mr. Cole?" A female voice, not Clara's, answered. "This is Dr. Patel from Riverton General Hospital. I'm calling about Sophia Morgan." Ethan's breath hitched. "Sophia Morgan?" "Yes, your daughter," the doctor replied, her tone gentle but firm. Ethan's world tilted. My daughter?" he stammered. Dr. Patel paused, seemingly surprised by his reaction. "Our records indicate you're listed as Sophia Morgan's father. She was born 3 years ago. She requires urgent cardiac surgery." The doctor continued speaking, but her words became a blur as Ethan's mind reeled. A daughter. He had a daughter, with Clara. Mr. Cole, are you there? Dr. Patel asked, bringing him back to the present. Yes, Ethan said, his voice hoarse. I'm here. What does she need? Dr. Patel explained the details of the procedure, but Ethan's mind kept flashing back to memories. 5 years ago, Clara had asked him, Ethan, do you want children? She had been nestled in his arms on their couch, her eyes full of hope. Of course, he had replied, laughing. I imagine a little girl with your eyes and my smile. Clara had kissed him softly, whispering, She'll be perfect. 3.5 years ago, Clara had tried to tell him something, her voice hesitant. Ethan, I need to talk to you. It's important. But he had waved her off, engrossed in his phone. Sorry, love, I've got an important meeting. Can it wait? Disappointed, she had nodded. Sure, later. But later never came. Weeks later, he humiliated her publicly, and she disappeared from his life forever. Back in the present, Ethan hung up the phone, his hands shaking. He had a daughter, a sick daughter who needed him. He grabbed his personal cell phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found Clara's name. He hesitated for a moment before pressing call. The line rang and went straight to voicemail. Clara, he began, his voice rough with emotion. I just found out about Sophia. Please call me back. I need to know everything. After hanging up, Ethan walked to the window of his office, staring out at the city of Orion. Its frenetic pace continued uninterrupted, oblivious to the emotional earthquake that had just struck him. A daughter, he whispered to himself, the weight of the revelation settling over him. Ethan spent the next few hours in a whirlwind of activity. He ordered his legal team to find out everything they could about Clara and Sophia's whereabouts. He canceled all his meetings for the foreseeable future, brushing aside his business partner's complaints. Sitting alone in his office, Ethan opened the gallery on his phone. He scrolled through old photos of Clara, smiling on a sunlit beach, laughing as they explored Paris, beaming at him on their wedding day. Her happiness in those moments was so tangible, it made his chest ache. How did we get here? He muttered to himself. That night, Ethan returned to his penthouse, alone with his thoughts. A suitcase sat half-packed on his bed, evidence of the decision he had made. Isabel called several times, her name flashing insistently on his phone screen. At first, Ethan ignored her, but eventually, he answered. Ethan, Isabel began, her tone impatient. Where are you? We have that investor dinner tonight. Ethan took a deep breath, steadying himself. Isabel, I can't make it. Her irritation was palpable. What do you mean you can't make it? This dinner is crucial. What could possibly be more important? I just found out. Ethan hesitated, the words still foreign to him. I have a daughter. With Clara. She's in Riverton and she's sick. I need to go. The silence on the other end stretched uncomfortably. When Isabel finally spoke, her voice was cold. I see, and what about us, Ethan? What about everything we've built together? Ethan closed his eyes, guilt and confusion warring within him. I don't know, Isabel. All I know is that I have to go to Riverton. I need to meet my daughter. Isabel didn't respond. The line went dead, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts. As the hours ticked by, Ethan stared at the suitcase on his bed, his mind racing. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. Nothing else mattered now, except meeting his daughter and making amends for the past. By morning, Ethan would be on his way to Riverton, heading toward an uncertain future, but one that he was determined to face head-on. The taxi came to a stop in front of Riverton General Hospital, and Ethan Cole felt his heart pounding in his chest. After a tense, anxious journey, he was finally here. Somewhere inside this towering, imposing building were Clara and the daughter he had only discovered a few days earlier. Taking a deep breath, Ethan stepped out of the car and into the hospital. The antiseptic scent of the place hit him immediately, stirring both unease and urgency. As he approached the information desk to ask for Sophia Morgan, a figure in the corner of his vision made him freeze. It was Clara. She stood at the end of the hallway, speaking softly to a nurse. Her hair was shorter than he remembered, and there was a tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there before. But it wasn't just Clara that caught his attention. Holding her hand was a small girl, and Ethan's breath left him. Sophia. The child was Clara's mirror image, with the same golden curls and delicate features. But when she turned her face slightly, Ethan's heart clenched. Those blue eyes, so familiar, were his own staring back at him. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Ethan was paralyzed, trapped in a snapshot of the family he never knew existed. His mind raced with thoughts of what could have been, and what had been lost. It was Sophia who noticed him first. Her curious blue eyes met his, and for a heartbeat, they simply stared at each other. Then, tugging gently at Clara's sleeve, Sophia pointed toward him. Clara turned, her expression shifting from confusion to shock as her eyes landed on Ethan. A myriad of emotions flickered across her face: fear, anger, disbelief, and something else Ethan couldn't place. "Ethan," she whispered, her lips barely moving. As though a spell had been broken, Ethan found his voice and legs. He stepped forward, his pulse loud in his ears. "Clara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I came as soon as I heard." Clara instinctively pulled Sophia closer, her grip protective. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she looked at Ethan. "How did you find out?" she asked, her tone a mixture of anger and fear. "The hospital called me," Ethan replied, glancing between Clara and Sophia. "They needed my authorization for the surgery." Clara closed her eyes, taking a deep breath as if summoning strength. When she opened them again, her gaze was sharp with determination. "We need to talk in private," she said firmly, nodding toward Sophia. Ethan followed Clara into a nearby waiting room. Sophia stayed behind with the nurse, though her wide, curious eyes followed them as they disappeared down the hallway. As soon as the door closed behind them, Clara turned to Ethan, the anger she had been holding back spilling out. "How dare you just show up like this?" she demanded, her voice shaking with years of pent-up frustration. "After everything you did, you think you can just waltz back into our lives?" "Clara, please," Ethan said, his own voice trembling. "I know I've made terrible mistakes, but I didn't know." "Didn't know?" Clara cut him off, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "When exactly was I supposed to tell you, Ethan? When you were too busy in your meetings? Or maybe when you humiliated me in front of half the city?" Each word landed like a punch, and Ethan winced under the weight of her accusations. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, though the words felt woefully insufficient. "I was a fool, but now I want to do the right thing for Sophia." Clara studied him, her expression unreadable as she tried to gauge his sincerity. Finally she sighed, the anger in her eyes softening into exhaustion. "Sophia has a congenital heart condition," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "She needs surgery. That's why we're here." Ethan felt the ground shift beneath him. The daughter he had only just discovered was gravely ill. What can we do?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Clara seemed taken aback by his use of we. She blinked, as if trying to decide whether to trust him. "The doctors say the surgery has a good chance of success," she said cautiously. "But it's expensive, and the recovery will take time." Ethan nodded, the initial shock giving way to determination. "I'll pay for everything, whatever Sophia needs." For a moment, Clara looked as though she might argue, but then she simply nodded, a flicker of relief crossing her face. "Thank you," she said softly, the words hesitant but genuine. Ethan glanced toward the door, where Sophia's small voice could be heard chatting with the nurse. His heart ached as he thought of all the time he had lost. "I want to be there for her," he said, turning back to Clara. "For both of you." Clara didn't reply immediately. Instead, she folded her arms and looked away, her expression pensive. For now, her focus was on Sophia's health, but Ethan knew there was a long road ahead to rebuild the trust he had shattered. In that moment, however, one thing was clear. Sophia needed them both, and Ethan was determined to be the father she deserved. A gentle knock on the door interrupted the moment, and the nurse entered with Sophia. The little girl peeked out shyly from behind Clara's legs, her small frame seeming even smaller in the sterile hospital room. Ethan knelt down, bringing himself to her eye level. "Hello, Sophia," he said softly, his voice trembling slightly. I'm your dad." Sophia looked at him with wide, curious eyes. She studied him intently for a moment, before a tentative smile broke across her face. "Hi," she whispered, her voice quiet but steady. Ethan's heart melted. Tentatively, he extended his hand, unsure if she would take it. After a brief hesitation, Sophia reached out and placed her tiny hand in his. Clara stood back, watching the scene unfold. Her expression was complicated, a swirl of emotions: anger for Ethan's years of absence, sorrow for the mistakes of their past, confusion over what his presence might mean for the future. Yet buried beneath those feelings was the faintest glimmer of hope. Ethan tried to engage Sophia in conversation, asking her about her favorite color and animals. His questions were clumsy but earnest, and Sophia responded with increasing confidence. For a fleeting moment, Clara allowed herself to imagine a future she had long since written off. A life where they could be a family. But reality pulled her back. There were too many unanswered questions, too much pain that hadn't yet healed. For now, she forced herself to focus on what mattered most, Sophia's health. The rest would have to wait. In the days that followed, Ethan became a regular presence at the hospital. He spent hours at Sophia's bedside, reading to her, coloring with her, and making up for the time he had lost. "What's your favorite color?" Ethan asked one afternoon, holding up a coloring book and a handful of crayons. "Purple," Sophia replied with enthusiasm, her eyes lighting up. Ethan grinned, handing her the purple crayon. He watched in awe as she bent over the book, her little face scrunched in concentration as she carefully colored. From the doorway, Clara observed them. Her emotions were a mixture of warmth and unease. Watching Ethan's effort to bond with Sophia was both heartening and painful, a reminder of the years they had missed. Later that evening, once Sophia was asleep, Clara approached Ethan in the hallway. "We need to talk?" she said quietly, her tone heavy with emotion. The tension between them was palpable as Clara turned to face him. "Why now, Ethan?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why decide to be a father now?" Ethan exhaled deeply, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I know I made terrible mistakes," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "But when I found out about Sophia, everything changed. I want to be the father she deserves. I want to do the right thing." Clara nodded slowly, her caution evident. She wasn't ready to fully trust him, but she couldn't deny that he seemed sincere. A few days later, Ethan accompanied Clara to the school she had founded. As they walked through the brightly decorated hallways, the sound of children laughing and chattering filled the air. "This is amazing, Clara," Ethan said, his tone genuinely impressed. "You've built something incredible." Clara allowed herself a small smile, the first genuine one Ethan had seen in years. But the moment was interrupted by the buzz of Ethan's phone. Isabel's name flashed across the screen, glaringly bright. "Are you going to answer that?" Clara asked, her expression darkening. Ethan hesitated for a beat before turning off the phone. "It's not important right now," he said firmly. Clara gave a curt nod, but the tension lingered. The next day, as Ethan played with Sophia in her hospital room, a figure appeared in the doorway, her voice slicing through the air like a blade. "Ethan." He turned sharply, his face paling. "Isabel, what are you doing here?" Isabel stepped into the room, her eyes narrowing as she glanced between Ethan, Sophia, and Clara, who had just entered. "I came to see for myself," Isabel said coldly. "I see you found your family." The word dripped with accusation. Ethan stiffened under the weight of her gaze, the consequences of his choices pressing down on him. Clara instinctively pulled Sophia into her arms, her posture protective. "I think you two need to talk," she said, her voice tense. "Come on, Sophia. Let's get some ice cream." As Clara and Sophia left, Ethan turned to Isabel, knowing the confrontation was inevitable. Weeks passed, and Clara began to notice subtle changes in Ethan. He was more present, more attentive, not only to Sophia but also to the hospital staff and the children at the school. One evening, Clara stood in the hallway watching as Ethan read a story to Sophia. Her heart softened, a spark of hope igniting despite her efforts to suppress it. "Has he really changed?" she wondered silently. She wasn't sure yet, but for the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, Ethan could prove her wrong. Clara's thoughts were interrupted by the sharp, urgent sound of monitors beeping frantically. She turned to see Sophia's small body trembling as a crisis unfolded. "Sophia!" Clara cried, rushing to her daughter's side. Ethan was already there, gripping Sophia's tiny hand tightly as a team of doctors and nurses flooded the room. "What's happening?" Ethan demanded, his voice breaking with panic. "She's experiencing a severe arrhythmia," a doctor explained briskly. "We need to stabilize her immediately." The hours that followed were the longest of Ethan and Clara's lives. They sat together in the waiting room, their fear binding them in a way they hadn't felt in years. Ethan reached over and took Clara's hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "She'll be okay," he whispered. though it sounded more like a plea than a promise. Clara glanced down at their intertwined hands, a storm of emotions swirling within her. For the first time in years, she didn't pull away. Finally, the doctor emerged, looking exhausted but relieved. "We've stabilized her," he said. "Sophia is out of danger for now." Relief washed over both of them, and without thinking, Clara threw herself into Ethan's arms. For a moment they clung to each other, united by their overwhelming love and concern for their daughter. When Clara stepped back, there was a new vulnerability in her eyes. "Ethan?" Before she could finish, the sharp click of heels echoed down the corridor. "Ethan?" Isabel's voice cut through the air, sharp and demanding. "We need to talk." Clara stiffened, her guard rising instantly. Ethan looked between the two women, his expression torn. "Go," Clara said coldly. "Sophia is stable now." Ethan hesitated but eventually followed Isabel to a secluded corner of the hallway. Clara watched them disappear before turning and retreating into Sophia's room, closing the door behind her. Clara couldn't hear what Isabel said, but as she glanced through the glass pane of the door, she could see Ethan's expression grow increasingly grim. When he returned, his shoulders were slumped, and his face was pale with conflict. "There's something you need to know," Ethan began. Before he could continue, Isabel interrupted, her voice sharp and cutting. "Let me tell her. After all, I've been the one standing by you all this time." What followed was a revelation of secrets and lies from Ethan's past, things Clara could never have imagined. Each word was a dagger, shredding the fragile trust they had only just begun to rebuild. When Isabel was done, Clara's face was pale, her expression blank with disbelief. Without a word, she turned and entered Sophia's room, closing the door firmly behind her. Ethan stood in the hallway, torn between following Clara and dealing with the consequences of his past with Isabel. The weight of his choices pressed down on him like never before. Ethan stared at his reflection in the hospital's bathroom mirror, his face etched with exhaustion and guilt. He knew what he had to do. Exiting the bathroom, he found Isabel waiting in the corridor, her arms crossed, her expression icy. "It's over," Ethan said firmly, his voice resolute. Isabel's eyes narrowed, her voice dripping with disdain. "You're throwing everything away for them?" "No," Ethan replied. "I'm doing this for me, for the man I want to be." Ethan walked into a hospital meeting room, where his company's board members were waiting on a video call. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice calm but steady, "I'm stepping down from the company, effective immediately. Furthermore, I'm donating my shares to fund Clara's school and cover Sophia's medical expenses." The screen erupted in chaos, objections flying from all corners, but Ethan simply ended the call. Walking back into the hallway, he found Clara standing outside Sophia's room, her expression unreadable. "I heard everything," she said, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Ethan, why?" "Because some things are more important than money or power," Ethan said simply, glancing through the window at Sophia's sleeping form. Clara's defenses finally crumbled. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Months later, Sophia, now fully recovered, ran across the yard of Clara's school, her laughter echoing in the warm afternoon air. Ethan chased after her, both of them laughing as they played. Clara watched from the steps of the school, a smile tugging at her lips. Ethan approached her, scooping Sophia into his arms before wrapping Clara in an embrace. "We're a family now," he said softly. Clara nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "Yes, we are." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the three of them walked home together, leaving behind the shadows of the past and embracing a future filled with love, forgiveness, and second chances. Ethan looked at Clara and Sophia, his heart overflowing with gratitude. The price he had paid for his mistakes was steep, but the gift he had gained in return was priceless. In that moment, Ethan finally understood the true meaning of success and happiness. It wasn't in the towering buildings that bore his name, the accolades, or the wealth he had amassed. It was here, in the laughter of his daughter, in the warmth of Clara's forgiving smile, and in the knowledge that he had finally become the man he wanted to be. As they walked together under the setting sun, the weight of past mistakes seemed to lift, replaced by the hope of a brighter future. Clara glanced at Ethan, her heart lighter than it had been in years. Sophia's giggles filled the air, a sound that seemed to heal wounds they had all carried for too long. They weren't perfect, and the road ahead wasn't without challenges. But as a family, they knew they could face anything together. What did you think of the emotional journey of Ethan, Clara, and Sophia? If this story touched your heart, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. What lessons did you take from this story of redemption and second chances? Do you have an idea for the next story you'd like to see? Share your suggestions below. And to never miss any of our upcoming heartfelt narratives, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Remember, just like Ethan discovered, the greatest treasures in life aren't in what we achieve, but in what we're willing to give up for love.